are recording the session. And I have also enabled the closed caption if anybody would like to use that option. So that's available to you. And so we know a lot of you might be joining us on your lunch hour. So if you would like to keep your camera off, that's totally fine. But we'd also love to see your faces. So please feel free to do either one. And we're so excited to have Dr. Jeanette Mancilla Martinez here with us today to share a presentation of her work. We'll have time at the end for Q&A, but always feel free to put questions and comments in the chat, and we'll monitor that as we go. And so with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jeanette Mancilla Martinez here with us today. She's an associate professor in the Department of Special Education, as well as the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Graduate Education for Peabody College. She holds an MED and an EDD in Language and Literacy from Harvard University, as well as a Bachelor in Liberal Studies with a concentration in English and Spanish from Mount St. Mary's College. She is the 2013 National Academy of Education Spencer Postdoctoral Fellow, a 2013 Hellman Fellow, and most recently a 2017 English Language Learners Policy Fellow. Dr. Mancilla Martinez's program of research is focused on advancing students' language and reading comprehension outcomes, including those of students from Spanish-speaking low-income homes. The studies she is engaged in build on her earlier research in reading development and focus on the central role of supporting students' language comprehension to mitigate later reading comprehension difficulties. Today, she's presenting on rejecting de facto characterizations of linguistically diverse homes as at risk for compromised educational outcomes. Thank you so much for being with us here today, and I'm really looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hasina, and everyone for joining this afternoon. As Hasina mentioned, it's a lunch hour, so please feel free to keep your cameras off. If you keep it on, it's nice because I can see you, but I'm going to share my screen momentarily. So I'll probably be able to see fewer of you. And it's my great pleasure to present this afternoon. It's always fun, at least for me, to share about the research that I'm engaged in because it's what I love to do. It doesn't feel like work to me in any way, shape, or form. So before I officially share my slides, I just want to start with a very brief background. Hasina did, thank you so much for that intro in terms of my program of research, but I think it's important to also give you a little snippet. And I know I see some familiar faces that have heard this story before, but those of you who have not, I started out as a classroom teacher in my native California. I'm a native Californian from Los Angeles. And it was really my experience as a classroom teacher, and in particular as a teacher of fourth graders, that really led me to pursue graduate studies, because I just really felt that I did not have the knowledge base I needed to really support students' meaning making from text, so reading comprehension. And that is the nuts and bolts of what my work is all about. And I continue to want to learn more about the scientific process of reading development and how we might support students who struggle in that very important domain, which is important and implicated in everything they do in school. And so it was the classic fourth grade, because some of you who are immersed in the reading world have heard of the fourth grade slump. And it's the time when, oh, now reading difficulties begin. Not exactly like they surprisingly began at fourth grade. We'll talk a little bit about that. But that's really what led me to graduate school. And I thought, let me go and get a master's degree. I'll become a reading specialist. I will know everything there is to know about reading development and be able to help teachers who then find themselves in a similar situation to where I was. And right, so that was my grand master plan. No pun intended there with my master plan. And so then I started the program. It was great, but it was really, really great. So I thought, no way I can end. And it was a 1 year, like 9-month program at the Harvard Ed School. Like that, there's no way in 9 months, I'm really going to learn everything there is to know, right? The more you learn about something, the more you know you don't know. And so I thought, oh my gosh, I need to continue. And I really fell in love with the research side of things. And I thought, oh my gosh, there's so many questions that we need answers to. Long story short, what was supposed to be a 1 year academic year stay in Cambridge, Mass, ended up being a 6-year stay. So it was 1 year for the master's and then 5 more for the doctorate. And it was a phenomenal experience. And the nutshell and kind of what brought it all together for me was that I worked on many different projects during my time as a doc student, as you can imagine. But at the end, my dissertation ended up being focused on developmental trajectories of students from Spanish-speaking homes, but I was in the East Coast of the US, right? Pretty different in many ways than the West Coast that I was used to in terms of they were children from Spanish-speaking homes, but from different countries of origin. Their families were from different countries of origin, and we can talk about that later. The short of it is that this was a developmental study. I was really lucky to inherit a data set that, predated me. So data had been collected from the time children were in preschool through 2nd grade. Then there was a gap in funding, and my advisor and I picked up on that longitudinal data set. And my dissertation work was focused on using those early indicators to predict outcomes now that the students were in 5th grade. It was really great because now we can more purely assess reading comprehension. But what I ended up finding was super depressing and kind of like what led me to graduate school, if that makes sense, that a lot of the children from Spanish-speaking lower income homes really had compromised English reading comprehension outcomes, and largely driven by low language skills, English language skills. And not all of them were English learners. We'll talk about that in a minute. So I just thought like, oh, am I back to square one? But really, I wasn't back to square one because I had learned a lot about the different pathways that might lead to difficulties and a lot of the contextual factors that influence reading development in particular. So once I finished my doctoral program, I started as an assistant professor at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Fabulous 3 years there. Then I went to the University of California, Irvine. So everyone thought, oh, you're back home, right? I had been almost a decade away from home, meaning the West Coast, California specifically. And my time at UCI was also phenomenal. So you might say, wow, this woman moves around a lot. But it just happened that these opportunities arose. Like I still have colleagues and friends at all these institutions. It was never because it wasn't a good fit. And when I was in California, everyone thought like, you're there to stay, right? Like it's been almost 10 years. We bought a home. We had our last boy. I have 3 boys. But I wasn't there to stay because it was 3 years. And then I came to Peabody in 2015, which surprised a lot of my family and a lot of my colleagues. And they thought, why are you going to Nashville? Don't you work with like linguistically diverse populations? And Tennessee doesn't seem like the right place. Well, boy, were they wrong, right? Because linguistic diversity is everywhere in the nation. It is not now like all relegated to certain states. So I'm kind of previewing what my talk is all about. So I've been at Peabody since 2015. I was initially in the Department of Teaching and Learning, and I'm now in the Department of Special Education. And as Hesina mentioned, I am also with an administrative hat as the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Graduate Education, which in Vanderbilt Peabody refers to PhD programs. And so my research has squarely continued to focus on better understanding reading development and supporting students who struggle in that area. And unfortunately, a lot of students who are from linguistically diverse homes struggle with reading comprehension for a whole host of reasons. So I'm going to go ahead, Hesina and Dwayne, is that okay to share my slides now? Okay, all right. So we're an intimate enough group that I am more than happy if someone just wants to pop in and ask a question, if there's something that I can clarify, and certainly we'll have time at the end for some conversation. So I don't want you to feel like I'm talking at you or anything like that, right? And so you see the title of my presentation, and it really has been that over the years, I've really become more and more frustrated with this notion that seems to be synonymous with linguistic diversity, and that's being at risk, right? So language is not a risk. And so let me walk you through, and it was hard to really boil it down to a couple of slides. There's so much we can talk about. So I'm just going to launch right into it. So thank you again to all of those of you who were able to join me this afternoon. So the agenda I have in store for today is that I want to start off with giving you a little preview of the reading achievement and social demographic landscape in the US, and then address some enduring debates related to linguistically diverse learners, and really end with some opportunities as I see them. Certainly not exhaustive, but just a kind of comprehensive-ish list. And then of course, we'll get into a discussion. So launching right into the reading achievement and social demographic landscape. First, I want to start off because my area is reading to make sure that everyone kind of has a sense of, okay, well, what is she talking about with reading? So this is an example of an item from the NAEP reading assessment. I am a member of the Standing Committee on Reading for the National Assessment of Education Progress. So I know these measures very, very well. This is an example of a fourth grade little passage from 2017. You can see details on the bottom left. And essentially, this kind of item is considered a locate and recall type of item that's multiple choice and labeled as medium difficulty. So most of you maybe have heard of the nation's report cards, see trends of how students are doing in the US, below, above, proficient, etc. And so this is the kind of assessment that students actually take in case you've never seen them or were wondering what this looks like. So what a student would have to do is read the passage. Now it's electronic, right? It used to be paper and pencil, and they need to be able to locate this particular passage and choose answer choice B to get this item correct, right? In terms of answering, what did the boy do to become successful? And so you might say, all right, well, there's the task. Seems pretty straightforward, right? But a whole lot is involved in students being able to do this. So there are many models and theoretical frameworks to explain reading and its development. I really like to use Scarborough strands because it's very reflective of the simple view of reading that many folks in the field don't like because it's too simplistic. And we know that it's so complex and interrelated factors shape reading development. But at its very basic, students must, at minimum, to answer the question I just showed you, be able to read the printed words. That's the word recognition in blue. Different ways you can proxy word recognition, and they must be able to understand the meanings of the words that they are reading, right? If they can't read the words, then we're now just focused on the oral comprehension domain. When you attach print, you necessarily need word recognition skills. Hope it's making sense so far. So if you at minimum have these two components, hopefully you'll be a skilled comprehender. You'll make meaning from text, and that's the ultimate goal of reading. The Scarborough strands to me are really a useful depiction of reading development precisely because of what happens when you weave these two components together. At the bottom, you can see that word recognition skills should become increasingly automatic over time. That means that there is usually a very concerted focus in the early elementary grades, let me just say, for simplicity, K2, on making sure students know the letters, the corresponding sounds, and are learning to read words, right? To eventually become really automatic and fluent in their word reading skills. Hopefully, by the time students are, let's say, in upper elementary schools, the vast majority have developed adequate, grade appropriate word reading skills. Obviously, not all students do, and there are students who struggle significantly with that development. But the idea is that the early grades really focus on word recognition, should become automatic. And so word recognition skills don't end up explaining too much of the variance in reading comprehension outcomes over time, right? Because you have them well developed. In huge contrast, you have this big domain of language comprehension. Word recognition is pretty much finite, right? You have 26 letters of the alphabet, X number of sounds they make. That doesn't mean it's an easy task, but more finite than language comprehension, which is proxied in many different ways. And the older students get, right, over the course of development, the more challenging, so to speak, the text they encounter. So the extent to which they know the language embedded in that text, that's really predictive of their reading comprehension outcomes. So we kind of know a good amount about the science of reading and what are some influential factors, right, that really move the needle to support students' reading comprehension. But yet we have this profile that continues and continues in the US, which is about 1 in 3 US students can read at or above the proficient level, right, in the nation. And so really makes you wonder and scratch your head and say, wow, if we know about reading and its development and how to support it, why do we stay stuck in this place, right? I just mentioned I have 3 boys. If I was told that only 1 of the 3 will be able to read at or above the proficient level, I wouldn't be satisfied, right? And say, oh, that's just fine. It's okay that the other 2 can. We shouldn't be just fine with the statistics for our nation's children. And so this is what really motivates the work that I do. And I think there are, of course, very complex interrelated factors that that kind of lead us to this position where we still are at about 1 in 3 US students reading proficiently. And not the least of which is our current testing kind of framework that we have in most schools. What I mean by that is that by and large in school settings, children are tested in the word level skills, word recognition, kind of like the phonics aspect. And trust me, phonics is super important. So that's, I'm not going in the direction of like, let's not teach word recognition skills. But as I mentioned, word recognition skills are more finite in nature. And there's been a lot of excellent research that has contributed to our understanding of how to support students to develop word recognition skills, including those that are struggling in that area and that may have learning disabilities, right? Like a classic dyslexic. And on the other hand, we don't know as much about how to support language comprehension and, as an extension, how to assess language skills. Even though we know that language skills are so predictive, early language skills are so predictive of later English reading comprehension outcomes. And it's a complex developmental process that takes a lot of time, and compared to assessments we have at the word recognition level that are kind of really quick, you could even have 1-minute assessments of word reading accuracy or correct words per minute. The same is not available in the language domain. So I understand why we're in this situation, but the bottom line is that students need a lot of support in terms of developing language comprehension skills, building that background knowledge, that conceptual understandings, right? Not just the word recognition skills. And so then we get to what I have focused on a lot, which is this population of students that we call by many terms. And I'm going to use the term non-English language background in this presentation, because that's really the term that basically means you are not from a monolingual English speaking home. So any child who's not from a monolingual English speaking home, I'll try to be as clear as I can, and I'm happy to answer questions if this is confusing. But basically within the NELB population in the US, you have generally 3 main subgroups. Students who are never English learners. That means they come from a home where another language or languages are spoken, but the student, him or herself, is proficient in English. So they start off, and for all intents and purposes, they look like a native English speaker, even though in the household something else may be spoken. And the student, him or herself, may or may not speak that language. Then you have the former ELs, which is students who are identified as limited English proficient and got reclassified as English proficient. So they have the English proficiency. And then we have the subgroup all the way to the right that most people think about automatically. And those are the current English learners, the children who are officially designated as having limited academic English language skills to access the curriculum without support. So as you can hopefully gather, these first 2 groups are, I'm calling them here, we can choose any other term, English proficient bilingual, in the sense that they have the English proficiency even though they're not from a monolingual English speaking home. And that last group at the end, the current ELs, are also from a non-English language background, but they are not yet proficient in academic English based on the testing that was conducted, okay? So when we think about squarely this group of students who come from homes where another language is spoken, and the big thing here is that their English proficiency affects their ability to meaningfully participate and succeed in a school setting that is in English only. But what I want to draw your attention to is this gradient. And in the US, I think we tend to operate in this or that, very binary, right? Dichotomized. So you're either monolingual or you're multilingual, could be bilingual, trilingual, etc. And really, it's a gradient, and the language skills and knowledge, receptive, expressive, reading and writing, are distributed depending on the context in which you learned it. So it's not as simple as yes or no. So I just want to underscore that aspect in terms of the language proficiency. That said, and this population of students, NELB broadly and current ELs in particular as well, they're a very diverse student demographic. So I do not want to stereotype and say, oh, wow, these are the characteristics and that's it. But that being said, and it's important to underscore that the vast majority of current English learners in the nation are US citizens. So they're US born, US citizens. That means, and I'm kind of skipping around, I'm not doing this in order, but that they have been instructed largely in English only context, because English instructional contexts are the predominant form of instruction in the US across states. And although hundreds of languages are represented in the homes of English learners in the US, Spanish continues to be the most prevalent. And that's the group that I focused on the most for that exact reason, and the availability of assessments in Spanish compared to other home languages. But the implications of this work span across language groups, or I hope they do, the work that I do. And the majority of current English learners in the US are young. It's a young population that tend to be in the K-5 years. And we continue to hear that this group of learners lag behind their English proficient peers when it comes to academic achievement. So of course, this risk label is like super salient. And this, remember the 1 in 3 you saw just a minute ago? Well, this is an optimistic picture of 1 in 10 because the stats are something like 8% of 4th graders, 4% of 8th graders who are officially designated as English learners can read at or above the proficient level. That is really awful and disappointing. And awful and disappointing if you remember the fact that the vast majority of these children are US-born US citizens in English instructional contexts, right? There's some variation within that, but the vast majority are. And there could be a whole host of reasons. This is not exhaustive. I'm just putting in some things that came to my mind in terms of why we have this profile and what people think about in terms of like the at-risk characterization of this population of learners. And what I want to just remind everyone of is that focusing on English learners is not for a specialized subgroup of educators or specialists in the US. Anyone who cares about advancing educational outcomes in our nation needs to pay attention to linguistic diversity, inclusive of English learners. As I mentioned at the very beginning of my presentation, there are these historical immigrant destination states like my native California, right, that people associate with English learners. But really, it is the case that there are English learners everywhere in all the states across the US, including in Tennessee, which I mentioned that some of my friends and professional colleagues thought like, why would you go to Tennessee? Well, the growth in the state of Tennessee, for example, in linguistic diverse learners has been enormous, tremendous, and continues to grow. So a state like Tennessee is considered often a new immigrant destination state, simply because a state like Tennessee has historically thought about, or focused on diversity in terms of race and ethnicity, and less so in terms of linguistic diversity. But there is a large and growing population of linguistically diverse learners in our own state. And so what I want to do then now is talk about a few of the debates. There are so many debates, right? Everything is debatable about this population of learners and their educational outcomes. And I purposely am not tackling the language of instruction for a simple reason that the vast majority of US students are educated in English only context. I know you've heard that several times already in this short presentation, but that is just a fact right now as it stands. So, and most of the research has focused on language of instruction, and there's so many different reasons why you can't compare. It's not like apples to apples when you look at the configurations of dual language programs, early transition, later transitions. I can talk about that if you want, but I thought that it'd be better if I focus on the issue of identification and reclassification, special ed, and academic expectations, which are all interrelated in terms of enduring debates. So let's start off with identification and reclassification of English learners. So it's important to think of policy, right? Like ESSA, every student succeeds at, because now there really has to be a more standardized procedure across the state for exit and entry into an English learner program, even though there's some discrepancy here and there, but you must have a home language survey at school entry. There's wide variation in the kind of instruments that are used. And I don't think I will get to the issue of waived English learners, but I didn't want to miss the opportunity to let everyone know that only because a student is identified as a student who does not have the academic English language skills to succeed in the classroom without English learner support doesn't mean that the parents have to accept the services. So parents can opt out of the services, and that's a subgroup of students that has not received too much attention, called waived English learners, that I can talk about more if folks are interested. But essentially, based on the home language survey is the initial way in which students may be identified as English learners, and they're assessed across all 4 language domains. So the home language survey, I don't think I put it on here, hold on. Oh yeah, so the home language survey is basically some form of these 3 questions. I won't read them to you, but if the parent, caretaker, guardian answers that a language other than only English is spoken in the home, acquired, used, then the student is flagged as their English skills essentially are assumed to be inadequate. If you say English, 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 the assumption then is, well, the student must have adequate English language skills, right? To be able, and they can access the curriculum, academic English skills to access the curriculum in English only. So in my view, in and of itself, the whole process of the home language survey and who gets tested on language skills. Do you remember just a minute ago, I talked about this current testing, right? And that there tends to be a big focus on word level skills, not so much on language skills. Well, the big exception is when you get identified as a potential English learner. That is where you are assessed on your language skills. And I haven't conducted this study, and at some point I hope I do, but I am pretty certain, I would place a big bet that if we administered this English proficiency assessment across the board to students, many students who are from monolingual English speaking homes would look in terms of their profile as English learners without the academic English language skills they need to access the curriculum. But that's not currently what we do. Anecdotally, that happened in one of my studies in Chicago in the preschool realm, where some students who were monolingual English speakers were administered the English learner assessment, and it's exactly what I just mentioned, right? So, okay, we can talk about that more, but there seems to be some inequity in and of itself in terms of the process of identification based on home language survey as the entry. So basically what happens, you get the home language survey. If the parent says anything other than English, you get the screener, right? And if you take the screener and you pass the screener, well, you're English proficient. Done. If you don't pass the screener, hold up, you are identified as an English learner. And I mentioned to you that the parents can decide to waive services, and some do. But the vast majority end up receiving the services, and whether or not they receive the services, the students must be monitored until they are English proficient. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. So waived or not, you must be monitored until English proficient. So that's kind of the lay of the land in terms of identification and reclassification. So in terms of reclassification, too many English learners become what is called, so many acronyms, LTEL. Long-term English learner, which is exactly what it sounds like, right? Students who are English learners for the long haul. So definitionally, it's students who are not making progress to develop the academic English proficiency within about a 6-year timeline. Hypothetically, you started as an English learner identified in kindergarten, now you're in middle school and you're still an English learner, right? You haven't been reclassified as English proficient. Naturally, that raises a whole host of questions as, is there a disability? Like what's going on? Like why is there some cognitive inferiority? Obviously, hopefully no one thinks that, right? But there's these questions of like, what might be happening? Why is it taking so long? Or, why aren't they being reclassified? After all, reading is language-based, right? So is there something happening in the language area? So I won't spend too much time on this slide, but what I just want to showcase here is these are the percentage of English learner compared to non-English learner students in the top 6 disability categories based on IDEA. And I hope you can see that specific learning disability is the one where you see the biggest discrepancy in terms of identification of ELs versus non-ELs, with more ELs being represented in SLD. And SLD, you have the federal definition on the top right. I won't read it to you, but SLD subsumes reading difficulties, which again has been my area of research, right? So there's these questions of like, well, is there a disability? In a couple of minutes, a couple of slides, I will talk about the issue of disproportionality, but now there are equity IDEA regulations that are squarely focused on the issue of disproportionality. Focus more on race and ethnicity, but I've been doing work on that area in particular related to language diversity. So there are actually exclusionary factors, right? In terms of identifying student with SLD. You can look at these and can probably really quickly see that it's going to be hard to disentangle whether a student who is an English learner actually has a specific learning disability. So that does not mean that that a specific learning disability cannot coexist with limited English proficiency, right? But we don't know, is it really because they just need more time to develop English proficiency? But remember, long-term ELs means 6 or more years that you've been receiving instruction and you haven't been redesignated. Is it because the instruction has not been high quality and sustained and adequate, right? Then we get into the RTI models, et cetera. And of course, like I said, you can have a disability and be an English learner, right? Hopefully to a lot of us, that doesn't sound like mind-blowing, but that can actually happen. And how can you actually tell? Well, there are so many reasons why this is complicated, and I'm going to talk about 2. One is the valid assessment limitations, and then I'll get into the disproportionality. So when we think about academic expectations, which is another debate, we tend to typically use a monolingual lens and a monolingual yardstick, and to be more specific, an English monolingual yardstick to compare students who are not themselves English monolingual. This is a little visual on the left of the revised hierarchical model, which is one framing of how basically underscoring that concepts are shared between languages and that there's distributed knowledge. There's some controversies also about this model and whether this model is outdated or not, but the reason I kind of like it is about the whole focus on shared conceptual knowledge, and I'll get to that momentarily. But essentially, we know that language proficiency and experience should be considered developmentally across the age span. And probably the most important point that language knowledge is distributed across the known languages. So basically the notion, right, that bilinguals or trilinguals, multilinguals are not a combination of different monolinguals all put into one. So it sounds really basic, but that's actually what we do when we test a lot of this population, is consider them as little monolinguals across the board. To be easy, a monolingual English speaker, a monolingual Spanish speaker combined into one. And so in our assessment, this is what I mean. Typically, if we conduct, let's say, a vocabulary assessment, right, a picture naming, you might give an assessment that's standardized with a norming sample that is English speaking. So guess what? Your response has to be in English, right? So if I show you a picture of a tree, you must tell me tree. If you say árbol, wrong, because you use the wrong language, right? And super frustrating. And it's happened to me over and over again, where children use the wrong language. There's no such thing, but you get what I mean. And so you have to mark it wrong because that's the standardized procedure. Like, you just have to. If you're lucky, you might say, oh, wait a minute, I have the Woodcock Johnson in Spanish also. So I'm going to administer that assessment. And now I'm going to show them this picture and they can say árbol. But if they don't know árbol, because they haven't learned that for that label, but they know tree, wrong also, because they have to use the language specific terminology, right? So what happens there is you can probably get the idea that you might get this profile of a child who's from a Spanish speaking home in an English context. You assess both languages using these monolingual norms, right? And you get low English, low Spanish. That gives you a red flag. Like, is there something going on? Again, could there be a disability? What's the issue? We assessed in the native language. Well, students in the US are largely not getting home language instruction, certainly not developing literacy skills. A lot of their parents and caregivers have lower levels of education. The assessment, something like the Woodcock, might be normed in Mexico City, where the different demographic and in terms of income and more. So what I've been doing over the years is exploring the use of these more conceptually scored measures, which for ease, I'm going to call Spanish English bilingual measure. Very simple notion that may have some benefit, some utility. And the idea here is that you would show them the picture of the tree and they can respond with the label in English tree or the label in Spanish árbol. What you care about is whether they know the concept, if that makes sense, not which language they know it in, to try and get more at the totality of the linguistic resources that students come into school with. It's a very different task, cognitive task, to teach a student a label for a known concept than to teach the concept and the accompanying label. So there's a lot of reasons why these measures that really take into account bilingual language acquisition research might be beneficial for us to start using in school settings. And these measures have been explored by many other researchers that really predate me, but mostly during the infant, toddler, and preschool years, and not so much during the school age years, the formal school age years. And so I just want to give you a comparative example. I'm going to be really fast on these slides, where this is a study from my dissertation, in fact, where we assessed, I mentioned that it was a study that started at pre-K and we ended at 5th grade, same group of children, so it's a longitudinal study. The black line, just to orient you, is the monolingual norms that are the same in English and in Spanish for the Woodcock productive vocabulary test. And then the blue long dashed line is our sample of students and how they performed on English productive vocabulary. And the red smaller dashed line is the same group of students, but how they performed in Spanish productive vocabulary. The main things for you to keep in mind here is that whether English or Spanish, they're below national monolingual norms where they should be from the beginning, even towards the end, and that there is an especially big gap in Spanish, which is not surprising because the majority of these children were getting instruction in English only. Does that make sense? But even by 5th grade, at the onset of middle school entry, there's an effect size of 1 in English vocabulary. So definitely looks concerning. Then we use these measures. This is a different sample of Spanish-English bilingual children. And I'm calling them bilingual in the sense that they come from Spanish-speaking homes. And this is in the state of Tennessee. And to orient you here, this is where we started exploring the use of these conceptually scored or bilingually scored Spanish-English vocabulary measures where they can answer in either language. And this is not an assessment that I developed. It's a published standardized assessment that's available for you to purchase. And it was normed and developed for Spanish-English bilinguals in the US. So what we get here is a very different profile. We had a cohort of students who we recruited at kindergarten entry, and we followed them until they were in 2nd grade. That's the red line. And then we had a cohort of students that we recruited at the beginning of 2nd grade, and we followed them through the end of 4th grade, right? So that's the blue. You can probably see that the black lines, you can hardly see them. And that's because our sample performed right on par with national norms based on this bilingual assessment, if that makes sense. So you don't see the big gaps that you see here in this case. So to us, to me, that's really useful information to have and to continue to explore the potential utility. I would consider it a win, even if teachers saw these trajectories and didn't automatically associate a deficit viewpoint about these students' linguistic resources. But even more so than that, it's this notion that I shared with you that knowing the more or less, you can never know the totality, but more or less a better gauge of the language resources students come into school with in terms of their conceptual understanding can really be helpful in teaching those associated labels in the English language, for example. And we have found that these measures, by the way, are predictive of English reading comprehension outcomes above and beyond English only vocabulary measures. So there's a lot more to explore with these kinds of tools, but I think that they're a fruitful direction to move in. And it's going to take a while because people are resistant to change, but I think we need to go in that direction. And then we have this issue of disproportionality, right? And so you saw this already, but what I really want to point out here is that current ELs in the US with disabilities represent almost 15% of the school-age population, and yet the intersection of language and special education status really remains understudied. And that's an area that I have continued to focus more of my attention to over the more recent years. So here I'm going to share with you these graphs that are on disproportionality that was just published earlier this year in Educational Researcher as a brief. And to orient you to this, the idea with disproportionality and the policy guidance is if the risk ratio, like basically think of it as your likelihood of being designated as a student with special needs, is 3.0 or above for 3 consecutive years in a given school district, that's a red flag for disproportionality, right? So when you're at 0, that's proportional. And so what I'm showing you here to orient you, this is a study that I have done using Tennessee state level data in collaboration with the Tennessee Education Research Alliance. And we are spanning pretty much like a decade from academic year 2009-10 all the way to academic year 17-18. And the trends look almost identical through the last academic year we have access to, which is 2020-2021. We just don't have it represented here in this paper that we published. But essentially, we had 3 language groups. native English speakers, which is exactly what it sounds like. And this is their risk ratio, just hovering about 1.5, right? So their likelihood of being in special education across any disability category, by the way, of the federally defined ones is about just hovering over 1.5. Then we have a group that we're calling the English proficient bilinguals, right? So these are also children who are from a non-native English speaking background, but they are proficient in English. And you can probably tell that English proficient bilingual children in Tennessee tend to be less likely to be represented in special education across any disability category, right? And then we have the group that is actually receiving services, current ELs. This is a cross-sectional sample. And you can tell that current ELs fall somewhere in the middle, but below native English speakers. So this alone might lead you to say like, what's the problem? I don't really see anything very interesting happening here. But we shouldn't see any differences, or at least not many differences, in terms of representation in special education by your language background. And we can see that there are some differences in patterns in the likelihood of you receiving any special education services based on your language background. Interesting with the blue line, that is the English proficient bilinguals, which I'll get to momentarily, right? So to me as a researcher, this is interesting, and we think like, what's going on here? We don't have evidence, by the way, of significant disproportionality in terms that even the scale doesn't go to 3 of 3.0 or above for 3 consecutive years, but there is no federal guidance on disproportionality in terms of underrepresentation. Everything is significant disproportionality with overrepresentation, if that makes sense. And the issue really should be misrepresentation, whether it's over or it's under. Are students getting the services that they are entitled to and that they need? This suggests that maybe not. So we also disaggregated this a little bit further and looked at within the group of children who are from a native English speaking home, are there differences based on their income background? Income tends to be a big predictor, right, of a lot of outcomes, a lot of potentially negative life outcomes if it's low income. And the black line represents native English speaking children who are from high income homes, and the blue, same native English speaking background from lower income homes. So you can probably tell that if you're a native English speaker from a wealthier family, so to speak, you're more likely to get services than if you're from a lower income family. Same thing, but now English proficient bilinguals. We already saw from the beginning that English proficient bilinguals tended to be less likely to be represented in SPED. And so we don't really see a big difference based on their income, whether they're higher or lower income. But for current ELs, we get the flip. So basically an interaction than what we did with native English speakers. And what we see is that if you are an English learner from a higher income home, you're less likely to be represented in SPED. And if you're an English learner from a lower income home, the blue line, you're more likely to be represented in SPED. So some interaction is happening as well with income, which again, shouldn't be an influencing factor in your representation for special education. So we, of course, right, we always dig deeper. Then we wanted to see what this looks like specifically for SLD, because as you might recall, I'm really interested in reading difficulties, and specific learning disability subsumes reading difficulties. So what you see side by side here, these are odds ratios. Now, I'm sorry, I haven't explained too much about risk ratios compared to odds ratios. Risk ratios in a nutshell, what you just saw on the left, past figures, you're not accounting for anything, meaning you're literally just representing what is the likelihood of representation in SPED without adjusting for any factors. With the odds ratio, what we did here was we both looked at unadjusted, not accounting for anything on the left, and then on the right panel, we adjusted for a whole slew of factors that have been known to be associated with likelihood of special ed representation, including your attendance rates, what is your income status, what is your reading achievement, so a whole host of things that I can get into later. But basically what we ended up finding was that if you're, and so the reference group is the black, where that one, that's proportional, that's the native English speaker group. We wanted to see if you are from a non-English language background, if you're proficient in English, which is the blue line, if you're not proficient in English, which is the orange line, how do you compare to native English speakers in terms of your representation in SPED? And you can see that for specific learning disability, If you're not adjusting for any factors, current ELs are more likely to be represented as specific learning disability, just like you saw in the graph I showed you a bit ago. And English proficient bilinguals tend to be less likely to be represented. When you account for all sorts of different factors that might influence your rates of representation, that's the right-hand side, you can see that the orange line dips below the black line, if that makes sense. So we're right about at an odds ratio of about 0.5. What does that signal? Well, we don't have guidance on what is underrepresentation, but the right-hand panel is basically comparing students that are matched on all characteristics except their language status. And when you match students on all these different covariates, and you're just focused, is there still a difference by language status? It seems to be the case that if you are from a non-English language background, you are less likely to receive specific learning, to be diagnosed with specific learning disabilities. So that's really interesting, right? And to say, like, is there actual underrepresentation? Are students who are non-English language background not being identified and receiving supports that that could actually help their academic trajectories? So I'm going to pause. There's so much more to unpack with that study, but I just wanted to give you a snippet. And in the interest of time, I'm going to wrap up. So in terms of opportunities and kind of takeaways as I see them and I have seen them over the years, it's really the case to me that I feel we really need to underscore at minimum that NELB students, including current ELs, are a vastly diverse group of learners. They're largely US born, US citizens, which I think a lot of people don't even know, including the educator workforce. There are hundreds of languages represented in their homes. Again, Spanish is the most common, but hundreds of languages. And NELB students, including ELs, typically receive English-only instruction across all regions of the nation. We also, of course, and that was kind of like what my title of my presentation alluded to, need to really think about this at-risk characterization that is so prevalent, because speaking another language or languages itself is not a risk. So at minimum, try to avoid framing conversations about this diverse group of learners as quote unquote challenges of working with NELB students and current ELs. And if we really focus our work on scientific understandings of bilingual language development and acquisition, as you can see from the figures I showed you, we get a very different, starkly different profile of students' language skills when we use monolingual only measures, even if we use monolingual English and let's say monolingual Spanish, than when we use a measure that accounts for both languages simultaneously, like the conceptual vocabulary. So of course, especially on the heels of the pandemic, right? We need to think about the opportunities to learn as opposed to the potential to learn. NELB students, like any student group, have the potential to learn, right? But are they offered the same opportunities as their peers? And they can succeed. So I wanted to at least show you this quick little snippet on giftedness because I think it's alarming and really worrisome. So I've been showing you profiles and risk ratios, odds ratios of disability categories. Well, in Tennessee, giftedness is also an exceptionality, right? And students get an IEP. Here you can see, hopefully pretty easily, that when we divided these languages, this is a work in progress that's in preparation. When you look at students who are native English speakers, that's the little dotted line at 1, that's our comparison group. Then we look at students who are never English learners, so right, they come from a home where a language other than English is spoken, but they were never identified as EL because they were English proficient from the get-go. Their representation and giftedness is the highest. When you look at students who are former ELs, they used to be classified as EL, they got reclassified as English proficient, they kind of hover around the native English speakers. But look at the current EL students, students who are identified as limited English proficient. We truncated the data that I'm showing you here to academic year 2016-17 because over the last handful of years, there are fewer than a handful of students in the state of Tennessee who are English learners identified as gifted. Does that mean that English is what makes you gifted? Right? It's just so bizarre. And I just had to show you this preliminary stuff on giftedness in terms of thinking about the at-risk conceptualization of this group. We think of them as super at risk, but not certainly as gifted. And so And back to reading, what's near and dear to my heart, it is the case, in fact, that very similar factors influence the reading achievement of non-English language background students, such as word reading and language comprehension, but to a larger extent than is the case with monolingual English speakers, as you might imagine, more sustained and purposeful language development support and opportunities to actively use language is needed for students who are developing academic English proficiency. I think it's a need across the board for US students, but certainly for those that have fewer opportunities, especially in their homes, for example, because of their home language environment. I did not have a chance, and I didn't even try to talk about teacher beliefs and their relation to student achievement, but I have another paper on that was published not long ago on Elementary School Journal that really links teacher beliefs, and those beliefs that are more asset-based tend to be positively related to English reading comprehension outcomes, and teacher beliefs that are more deficit-oriented, as you might suspect, negatively predict English reading comprehension. So they really do matter a whole lot. And of course, I can't not say this, that we really need a better understanding of this intersection of language and SPED status, especially on the actual referral process, right? We have these equity regulations and idea that really establish the system of identification in terms of significant disproportionality of overrepresentation. But we're really getting an indication that in Tennessee, similar to what others have found, there seems to be this trend of underrepresentation, maybe because teachers are taking this wait and see approach that if you're an English learner, for example, you can't, let's just wait and see what happens, right? And it might be related to this issue of long-term English learners as well. And the central issue really is misrepresentation and providing the actual support students require and students deserve. So I'll stop with that, and I'm happy to have a discussion. I know we don't have too much time, but thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Jeanette. That was great and super interesting. I'm biased because I have an interest in language and learners, but I'm going to open it up for questions. So folks can feel free to jump in with a question or throw a question in the chat.
Wonderful.
While we're waiting, I'll throw out an initial question I had. So what do you think is the best way to sort of reach educators and teachers on the ground about the kind of research you're doing and about your findings in order to sort of really create some change?
Oh, Dwayne, I wish I knew the answer to that, but okay, I'll give it a little stab because it's so hard. It really, really is. And no one wants to hear PD, right? Because PD sounds so much like you're going to go in for this X number of minutes that you go in for a session. All right, done that. And like moving on to the next big thing. But I actually think that we're going to have to, as a field, right, in education, broadly construed, certainly in language and reading, need to think very carefully about our teacher prep programs and their different iterations and what teachers are getting there as a start, right? It's kind of like a not super satisfying answer because it's going to take a lot of time. But I just feel that if there has to be like a multi-pronged approach to try and reach the educator workforce, and not the least of which is the training that they get in their teacher prep programs. I mean, I'm always left with my like jaw dropped when many educators, and it's not their fault, right? If they didn't learn things, they didn't learn things, right? That they don't know basic facts about this population that is linguistically diverse, and that they just feel like linguistic diversity means limited English proficiency, for example, and that they don't know that students can qualify for both EL services and special education services if needed, right? I'm not by any means saying, oh, let's get more English learners into special ed. That's not my point at all. The opposite is also true, that you can actually be gifted. Who cares if you don't have English proficiency, right? So it's just going to take so much work. And sometimes I feel my mind is like a little grain in the sand, but I hope that it's, eventually going to, at least for a subset of the population, be informative and move away from, and I don't just mean it in the, very kind of cheesy way, like, oh, let's get away from deficit framings. First of all, I firmly believe that. But second of all, there's actual empirical evidence and scientific evidence that we have to guide our decisions by. So anyhow, that's not really an answer, but sort of a stab at it.
Molly. Looks like Molly had it.
Yeah.
Hi, Jeanette.
Hey.
First of all, thank you so much. This work is so important. And even though it may seem like a grain of sand, it's a hugely important grain of sand.
Thank you, Molly.
So I want to thank you for that and just underscore how important it is. And also just the directions that you noted for future research and more pursuit. But the question I have for you, and please think of this in any framework you'd like, for those of us who are passionate about young children in early childhood years, what should we be doing, and what do you recommend needs to happen in addition to professional development?
You mean to support students more during their early childhood years?
Yes.
Yes. Well, oh, Molly, that I feel I have a pretty solid answer to. That's not going to be specific, but solid in the sense of I honestly and wholeheartedly feel that there needs to be more emphasis on knowledge development in the earliest years. And I don't mean like sit down and teach someone like facts, right? And there's this little 4-year-old just learning facts, but just a lot of exposure to content and rich language interactions and allowing students to actually talk, which is messy and it should be messy. But that's what I mean by it's language development is such a long-term process. And you're not going to see, I don't think, the real reaping the benefits of that language support until later on. And that's fine. I don't think policymakers are going to agree with me that that's fine because they want to see change like yesterday, right? Or 2 weeks ago. But that's really the way it works. And it reminds me, Molly, of some of Dale Farron's work recently on the preschool years and kind of that we've been focused on the wrong things. And of course, you need this word reading development. I 100% agree. If you're talking about reading comprehension, you can't not learn the letters and their associated sounds, but that can't be devoid of meaning. And that's where the conversational aspect and being exposed to, and that's where differences come in terms of income, right? Because wealthier or more middle upper class families are able to afford their children these opportunities and these world experiences, so to speak, at a different rate than children that are growing up in poverty or in lower income homes. And I don't mean that to stereotype, and trust me, I came from a low income home that I was an English learner. So that doesn't mean I know everything about that population of learners, but there are these differences that we can't pretend they don't exist. And then really think about how we as educated workforce can really penetrate some of those domains. Because if we didn't believe we can do that in schools, none of us would be in this line of work. That doesn't mean you ignore the context and what's happening in home and elsewhere in the neighborhoods, but I really do think that there's a lot more that can be done in the classroom settings, in language specifically.
Thank you, Jeanette. Yeah, awesome.
I think Jackie has a question.
Hi, thank you again. I am a former special ed teacher that in my earliest years, your graphs bear out what my students had in terms of language and also their other categorizations. So it was a little bit almost disorienting to see it in your data like that. But thank you for your work. And what you were just saying about the context and holding the realities, a lot of your work is that giving young people the tools that are foundational to literacy, but also you're talking about how it connects to what's possible. So I'm thinking of a conversation Hasina and I have had, and I've had with others around how it's so important that, and my work is often with young people. So how do we give them a context where they're learning tools with each other and with us, and prepare them for what's possible and reimagining that? And how do you see that connecting into your work?
Okay, Jackie, I'm sorry. I'm just going to, I didn't really understand your question. So can you either rephrase it or repeat it to make sure I get it right? Because otherwise I'm going to miss it completely.
I have a tendency to make convoluted questions. So I think a lot of your work with literacy, you're grounded in what young people have to know to be able to read. And obviously that connects to what's possible for them. But how else are you thinking about that transformation piece of this work? So you have to have the reality of skills you learn. How else do you see what you're doing as connecting to preparing not only students, but all of us for transformation and for reimagining the world that we're in now that has a lot of things going on that are not ideal?
Oh, well, that's a huge question. I'm certainly not going to be able to address that, but I do think I can address at least part of it, whereas that change is difficult for almost everyone, right? And something to me that is so simple as you said, like, okay, in my work, because I'm so steeped into the reading aspect and what contributes to reading development, how can we move the needle in that direction? It's one little piece of the big puzzle of how you become a contributing member of society, right, as a whole. And there's so many different factors and interrelated factors that relate to that development. But I think that I have over the years and over time developed more and more of an interest in making sure that at baseline, or kind of as a foundation, that we really kind of try to stop siloing people and experiences into this or that. I don't know if this is making any sense, but if educators don't know a lot of the facts about this population of learners and kind of have these stereotypical notions, that already is kind of a deal breaker in the sense of how you can really have high expectations of students. And you can't just say, oh yeah, I expect a lot from Jackie. I really, want her to do her best. What am I doing to actually help you in that pathway to do your best, if that makes sense? And I wish I had had a chance to talk a little bit about this teacher beliefs work that I've done. The most recent one is with elementary school teachers and their beliefs, but it's, some people think, oh, if you give a survey, educators are not going to be that honest. Oh, they're honest sometimes, right? In what they tell you. And it's like, whoa. And it's really important for you to know that in order to be able to possibly affect some change. And so there's this whole other line of work that I'm hoping to engage in more, which is better understanding the referral process and the RTI process and how students are talked about in those data team meetings, who is referred to for further screening, what measures are they using? I mean, it's just kind of endless, right? So the more you dig into something, I have like a million more questions that I don't know the answer to.
All right, well, thank you very much, Jeanette. I know everyone enjoyed hearing about your work, and I know we're a little bit past the hour.
Yes. But if anyone has questions, you can always reach me directly. You got my email.
All right, well, let's everyone give Dr. Mancilla Martinez a round of applause.
Thank you all for joining on a Friday afternoon. I enjoyed it. And again, I encourage you to reach out to me directly and we can continue conversations. Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend. Thank you, Dwayne.